Everybody, we're really lucky to have a terrific speaker today, a terrific topic for our very first CSA lecture of the 2023 spring semester. Thank you for being here, and I hope you're as excited as I am to listen to a talk about Sanskrit poetry, literary theory, poetic magic, the legendary author of the Ramayana, Valmiki, amongst other things, from my colleague in the Department of Asian Languages and Cultures, Professor Jamal Jones. And I'll just say a few things about Jamal before I open up the floor to him to give his talk. Currently, Jamal is an assistant professor in the Department of Asian Languages and Cultures, and before coming to UW-Madison, he was at UC Davis, where he taught in the Department of Religious Studies. He received his BA and his PhD, his BA in Religious Studies, his PhD in South Asian Languages and Civilizations from the University of Chicago, an institution that I came to know pretty well over the years, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, we navigated some of the same buildings and had even a few of the same professors. Although I was done long before, I don't know if long is appropriate, but I was done before Jamal started.
We had a slight overlap, I think, at some phase.
Makes me feel better to think of it that way. So, yeah, but we definitely know the sort of territory of South Asian studies at Chicago. During his time at Chicago, and ever since, much of Jamal's research has examined classical Sanskrit and Telugu literature to illuminate the broader history of religion and culture in pre-modern South India. He's currently working on a book project that has the provisional title, Powers Beyond Words, Ritual, Astrology, and the Politics of Poetry in South Asia. And his talk today is going to be a snapshot of one of the chapters from that book. In addition to that monograph, he's also working on an English translation of a 15th century Telugu long poem called The Nine Masters. And with that, please welcome me in introducing, or rather welcoming Professor Jones to the podium to give a talk entitled The Auspices of Aesthetics, the Metaphysics of Poetry in the Early Kāvya Movement.
Hi everyone, thanks for coming. Nice to have intimidating to have a kind of full audience here today. Thanks to Hannah Abigail for arranging things, and Sarah and Andrea and Anthony for the introduction. And yeah, thanks sort of in advance for your engagement, for your sort of questions, comments, and things at the end. I'm definitely going to benefit from any questions or thoughts you have, your expertise, your experience, your curiosity. Because this is, as Professor Cerulli said, a work in progress, pulling together some kind of draft material and thoughts that I have. You'll see the thoughtiness of this shortly. From mostly the sort of introduction and first chapter of my book, Powers Beyond Words. So some of this is going to be kind of synthetic, kind of engaging with some ideas in previous scholarship. We'll see some kinds of readings of texts that may be very familiar to some of you, particularly the Valmiki Ramayana, as well as some material that you may be less familiar with. And I think to kind of give a long kind of frame to some of the new material that I'm really trying to think through and sort of piece together now, this semester particularly. What I'm working from is material from this first book, Powers Beyond Words. The subtitle is always changing. Right now it's something like Metaphysics, the Metaphysics and Politics of Poetry in South India. And it's meant to be this kind of literary history, history of literature, that examines the practices and theories that consider poetry to be a form of basically immediately, efficiently, and to use a somewhat problematic and provocative term, but helpful, at least for the moment, magically efficacious speech. So speech that's directly capable of transforming one's sort of reality, their fortunes in the world. And I got into this research basically by studying certain kinds of late medieval or early modern texts and traditions from South India, particularly in the states now covered by Andhra Pradesh and Telangana. So I'm mostly between in the 1500s is when sort of my focus in my dissertation started. And according to the literary historians and then the sort of sources that I began engaging with in Sanskrit and Telugu, there was a kind of distinct tradition that described certain connections, basically, between the sounds and the rhythms of language, particularly as it's used in poetry, right? So these often connect sounds, the sounds of language, the rhythms of poetry, to divine and celestial entities. And to use these sounds in poetry is to kind of manipulate, manifest, and actualize these powers in ways that have consequences for the poet, for anybody listening to the poetry, as well as the person who the poem is about. And a lot of poetry from the medieval period happens to be about people, praising people usually. And so we can kind of see some of this here already in thinking about, this is from one of the texts that I looked at in my dissertation, the Chamatkara Chandrika, or the Moonlight on Astonishment, that details the sort of outcomes of using particular sounds at the beginning of a poem. So the sound ka brings you prosperity, pa, protection, ra will actually torment you, the sound ya might bring you wealth. And you can also see this in poetic rhythms as well. So they use a term in Sanskrit, gana, which I translate as metrine, but it's a kind of unit of rhythm. And there are 8 of these traditionally in kind of classical Sanskrit poetry. But all of these, you have their kind of formal shape, the actual rhythm itself. You have the consequence, what it gives you. But then you also have this sort of divine and elemental connection that is actualized by using the rhythm in a certain place. So key to all of this, I want to emphasize, is the genre of the language use. So we're not limited to thinking about something like Sanskrit, which is often imagined and sort of described as being sort of metaphysically powerful, capable, magical in the way that it can speak to and touch reality. But it's a power that's possessed by poetry, whether it be in Sanskrit or Telugu or Tamil. And this is confirmed by the sort of materials that I have focused on in my research, as well as other things that you might be able to find more in, say, the 1600s in northern India that talk about poetry written in the sort of regional languages there. Now, the hallmark of this analysis, which we begin to see here, is that it looks at poetry and describes these powers mainly through the lens of astral science, which is called Jyotishastra in Sanskrit, or Sanskrit referring traditions. And these are really interested in understanding and describing what they call the Shubha and Ashubha qualities of poetic language. So these words, Shubha and Ashubha, mean auspicious or inauspicious. And we see with metrical rhythms that these are attached linguistic elements, here are rhythms, to celestial and divine entities. And in a way, these also reminiscent of, for those of you who are familiar with, say, Tantra or ideas about mantra and the sort of notions of sort of divine language there are clear affinities with that line of thought. But there are actually very few explicit references or engagements with sort of Tantra or Tantric texts as such in the sources in the poetic sources that I've been looking at. I'm happy to talk about some of those if anyone's interested in the Q&A, but I'm going to bracket them mostly for now. Based on some recent research, but before I get there, I just want to say, this way of thinking is thought to be very important, necessary for poets. in the medieval and late and early modern period. You can't do this without literally hurting yourself. If you don't know how to do this, or if you do, I'll say a little bit about that in a second, you can literally be the death of kings, who are generally the kind of patrons of poetry, the sort of ideal patron of some kind of royal person. And I just want to give a note, there's a sort of Telugu film from the 70s that picks up on these ideas of the power of poetic language, called Vemulavana Bhima Kavi. He's this kind of legendary poet in Andhra and Telangana, who sort of is the sort of ideal type of this poet who can sort of magically affect reality through his poetry. And he knows how this stuff works, and he destroys people's lives, basically. So I just wanted to flag it. I haven't gotten a chance to see the film yet. I've read a lot of legends about him, but I thought it would be a helpful kind of point. But so this kind of idea has a long tail. It's very prevalent of poetry being magical, and it sort of survives and persists for a long time, though is often overlooked in scholarship in certain ways. But I say it's these ideas, and my focus has been in the medieval period, and based on some recent research I've been sort of completing in the last few months, I'm fairly confident that there's something like a hard beginning to this way of analyzing poetry. Or at least it's not sort of put down in writing in any particular way, and the connections with astrology in particular are not put down in writing in the way that we see it, and before the sort of 12 or 1300s. My first datable reference is in the mid-1200s from a text on music from Maharashtra. But one of my more compelling sources, which I've given an excerpt here from, is called the Kāvya Pasha, or the leash for poets. And it's about controlling poetic speech, precisely because poets have this great power through their use of poetry to affect reality, and particularly pointing to these ideas of, again, the shubha lakshanam, the auspicious and inauspicious, or benefic and malefic features of speech, as well as the capability of certain people, the skillfulness in shapa and anugraha, which is the shapa anugraha kushala phrase here, which has to do with cursing, shapa, and blessing people. And this is a power that's generally attributed to gods, sages, particularly powerful personages in the universe. But this text really begins to shift the location of that power away from the speaker, right? Away from exceptional speakers to it being some quality inherent in the language itself. So this text, the Kāvya Pasha, has been a key piece for me, synonymous, not clearly dated, but clearly has a connection to some texts in Tamil that talk about similar issues, which are likely from the 1200s or so. So I say all this to kind of give you a sense of kind of what my subject is, but also this last piece to note that part of what I'm interested in is this kind of historical dimension of it, that these particular set of ideas, whatever other ideas we might have about something like Sanskrit in particular, and whatever you're doing in Sanskrit as being sort of metaphysically powerful, that when we're talking about poetry, it has not always been the case, right? People did not always consider Kāvya, the poetic tradition, and poetic works to have this kind of magical power to command the forces of reality. So what I'm doing in the book, and what I'm going to do a little bit for you today in some targeted ways, is try to think through a kind of prehistory to this, kind of where some of these ideas are coming from. You all may have some ideas as well that you can share. But really to also kind of focus in on some of these terms that are being used by this medieval tradition, the Shubha and Ashubha, as well as a number of, let's go, skip ahead for a second, some synonyms, Mangala and Bhadra, all of them having their kind of inverse, Mangala, Ashubha, Abhadra, as being the sort of opposite, the misfortunate or inauspicious or sort of bad kind of quality. So, the basic thing to note, though, just to kind of give you some more frame, is that poetry is in fact considered this kind of it is an important genre, but it's not magical. It's a kind of distinct genre that is separate from things like mantra or the sort of the words and sounds of the Veda, which are understood to have some kind of innate connection to reality and to kind of command and sort of touch the forces of reality in a direct way. Now, that said, we certainly have these sort of ideas of poets and poetry as being magical in a kind of metaphorical sense, right? So there's some sort of classic statements of this. There are others out there that you can imagine, but there's Subandhu, the sort of early prose poet, who describes poets as kind of basically being able to kind of hold or create worlds in the palms of their hands through the power of the goddess Saraswati. There's Kalhana and his Rajatarangani, who calls poets gods. He uses the phrase Kavi Prajapati to kind of describe the poet's ability to, again, kind of create worlds from something like whole cloth, and in this case, to kind of bring, turn back the wheels of time and bring back things that are gone into the present. But this is metaphorical, right? It sort of captures this idea of poetry, the poet as being able to create worlds to enchant us in certain ways. There are also, in one of our, maybe our second oldest or third oldest sort of text on literary theory, the Kāvya Darsha of Dundin, there's a sort of acknowledgement that a poem should have a kind of, we could say, metaphysical framing in some cases, right? It should open with what's called an ashik, the sort of statement of blessing or request from blessing, or namaskriya, this one of these salutations often to like a deity or other sort of powerful person in the universe. But I would note that this is an option, right? It doesn't have to start this way. You don't have to sort of pull a poem into the sort of metaphysical world in that way. And finally, I just want to note and sort of to kind of revisit this idea of poetry as a distinct genre. This is from the 11th century, this quote, Namaka and the Kāvya Prakasha, or light on poetry. He starts out, this is the second verse of his work, sort of explaining the sort of what poetry is for, what it does. Poetry is for fame, it's for prosperity, it's for learning customs or the ways of the world, something like that. It's for destroying misfortune or misfortunate things. Shivetara kshataye. It's for the sort of blissful experience, and it sort of delivers counsel in the style of a lover. Kanta sammitaya is what he says. And so Mamata does a kind of auto-commentary on his work, and he explains in particular the piece that I want to focus on because it sort of employs one of the terms I'm interested in, the Shivetara kshataye, the sort of poetry as being the sort of means of combating inauspiciousness. Excuse me. And his particular example is a poem of 100 verses called the Surya Shataka. So this is 100 verses in praise of the sun god. It's by the poet Mayura, who was probably around the 7th century or so. And though Mamata doesn't go into it, he just makes the allusion. There's a story around Mayura that he suffered from leprosy, and that he went to the temple of the sun god and composed these verses, which are, simultaneously praising the sun god and asking for his sort of protection and grace and healing. And lo and behold, the poem works. I would note here, though, just to kind of give you a sense of what I'm trying to focus in on in some of this work, that the poet does not magically affect his own cure through his poetry, right? He's not kind of casting a spell or something on himself, or sort of marshaling divine power directly, as you might do through sort of articulating a mantra, right? He's using poetry that's generally in line with the way that Mamata is sort of thinking about poetry broadly, and the way that I would say that poetry is generally thought about, throughout its history, but particularly strongly in the sort of first millennium of the Common Era. And that's to say that poetry is a distinct speech genre with particular powers of, say, persuasion, right? And this is called out by Mamata's distinction between the sort of threefold scheme of speech genres in Sanskrit. There are things that sort of acts that command, that through their precisely how they're said, the shape of their very sounds. This is something like the Veda, mantra, shastra. There are things that sort of work through the kind of narrative content, the sort of meaning, the gist that you can get from them. And these offer counsel and sort of instruction the way a friend might. So these are things like epics, Puranas, other kinds of story material. And then there's poetry as our kind of third type, which strides this kind of line. So what is said, the sort of meaning, the content is as important as how it is said. And here is where Mamata makes a connection between poetry working like a lover. So it's somehow this sort of effectively poignant, aesthetically rich kind of verbal experience that affects you. And in a way, right, I think this, I think underlies certain ideas of when certain times that we often now, even today, kind of think of poetry or other kinds of artistic things as magical, right? There's some kind of enchanting quality, right? They enthrall you. I think it's captured, just to give a nice encapsulation of this as well, from a 12th century Telugu poem. An arrow shot by an archer or a poem made by a poet should cut through your heart, jolting your head. If it doesn't, it's no arrow, it's no poem. So is a sense that a poem can directly affect you, right? But it's a kind of emotional, affective, psychological experience that may have, ramifications for, the way your body moves in this micro sense, as well as what your maybe, what you may go on to do having heard the poem. So, just looking in broad strokes, there's this kind of absence in something like an early, if you do a sort of survey of a kind of Kāvya, poetry, poetic production, thinking about poetry before 1200 or so, where poetry isn't really magical. In any direct way. It's, if we follow Mamata, it's a distinct genre from the kinds of verbal activity that we might call directly magically efficacious. But one piece of the story that I am sort of been thinking through, sort of been hung up on, let's say, is that, okay, it's true right, that we can say that poetry is not magic, and then it becomes magical, let's say, or at least according to certain people, not everyone is interested in thinking about it that way. But that it becomes this kind of metaphysically efficacious thing sometime in the 1200s, maybe a little earlier. But if we kind of think about at least the story that poetry tells about where it comes from, poetry in Sanskrit tells, this means that poetry kind of had to become magical, it had to stop being magical in the first place. And so what exactly do I mean by that? So I have an image up here, which I'll hold up for a while, from the critical edition of the Valmiki Ramayana. And it's capturing an early and sort of key moment in the story, which is this kind of meta moment before you get into the meat of the story about Rama and Sita and all of that directly. So, keeping that in your line of vision, legend has it that Kāvya, poetry, was created by a curse, or in a curse. And the story is well remembered. We find allusions to it, we have it in certain recensions of the Valmiki Ramayana, and sort of become a common part of it at this point, the text we have. But there are allusions in many prominent works of Sanskrit poetry throughout time, including our sort of earliest surviving Mahakāvya, which is Ashwagosha's Buddha Charita, or the life of a Buddha. So even though we think of Valmiki Ramayana as a kind of grammatical Hindu text, we have a Buddhist poet sort of acknowledging even the sort of creation of poetry is happening in Valmiki's creation of the Ramayana. So according to the prologue here, Valmiki, our sage, soon to be author of the Ramayana, he had the question, who's the most virtuous man to have ever walked the earth? And he goes to Narada, this celestial sage who's supposed to know everything that goes on earth. And Narada tells him, well, it's Rama, of course. And then he gives him a digest of the story. So having heard the sort of bare bones of the story, Valmiki is quite happy. He goes off with his disciples to take a bath on the Kāvya River. So as he's preparing to go about his business, he sees a pair of water birds, kranchas, making love by the riverbank. And then he sees come into the scene this sort of forester, hunter, who, as Valmiki's watching, takes aim and shoots the male bird dead. So, the female bird still alive is grief-stricken, horror-stricken. She laments in bird song, and Valmiki, sort of overcome with a kind of pity for the grieving bird, joins her by crying out to the hunter in this sort of famous verse, Ma nishada pratishtam tvam magama shasvati samaha yat kramcha midunare ekam avadihi kama mohitam. Never, Nishada, shall you settle in all your years, since from among the Kramcha lovers you shot one drowned in desire. So he says this sort of grieving statement, curses the Nishada, this hunter. But after he does this, he kind of has this moment of reflection, and he says, what's happened here, basically? He feels like his words have taken this kind of unique, this new form. And then so seeing the grieving bird and then being struck with grief or shoka through his own sort of perception, compassionate perception of the situation, he says he's produced a new verse form, which I translated in a kind of antiquated style here, just for fun. Made in verse with syllables equally set, fit for drums and stringed instruments. What came as I was pained from heart was naught but the shloka's verbal art. So he says specifically in Sanskrit, there's this pun. He says he turns his shoka into the shloka, which is the sort of general term for a verse form. But even after doing this, he's still kind of perplexed about what's happened. He goes back to his ashram. He's sort of turning it over and over and over in his mind. And then finally, the creator god Brahma comes, and seeing Valmiki kind of in this weird sort of rumination and distress from what's happened, explains that he actually, the god Brahma, sent the utterance, sent this new verbal form, which is in fact a sort of manifestation of the goddess Saraswati. And he sent it, this sort of divine form, so that Valmiki would be able to compose the story of the most perfect man, Rama. So, this story, by all accounts, as generally sort of beloved, because this is kind of poignant account of the creative process and the power of the poetry, how one can sort of take a kind of mundane but intense emotional experience and sort of transform it into something more kind of transcendent in aesthetic terms. But it's really curious to me that for all of that, we don't really talk about the fact that this was in fact a curse. Right? There was a kind of magical utterance. It seems mostly insignificant. In some ways, it's even unclear what the curse means. Right? We're not given a clear articulation of the consequences of this for this hot hunter, this Nishada. Even if you translate it differently, rather than simply like the Nishada is not going to settle down or find rest, which is how it's often translated. Some people take this term for rest and translate it as fame or renown, which is maybe a little clearer. As a consequence of this verse, the hunter is in fact infamous. But it's a very different kind of curse, very clearly, right? It doesn't work the way some of the other curses in the Ramayana work. Like if we think of like the story of Ahalya and the sage Gautama, right? So Gautama, angered at Ahalya and Indra's affair, curses both of them, right? He functionally gelds Indra in some versions, and other things happen to him depending on which version of the Ramayana you're most familiar with. And these things happen immediately, right? His testicles fall right off. Or Ahalya is immediately rendered invisible or into a stone or what have you, right before the sort of narrative audience's eyes. But the kind of magical, sort of imperfectory aspect of this curse is almost entirely evacuated. And it's like the barest of sort of plot devices to give us a way to move on to talking about this new poetic form, this new aesthetic experience. One exception I'll note, which we can talk about, is in the 17th century, Sri Vaishnava theologians for whom the Ramayana becomes not just a sort of classical poem, but a scriptural source. They spend a lot of time thinking about the fact that the first verse composition around the Ramayana, related to the Ramayana, was in fact a curse. So they have to kind of flip it so that it's no longer this kind of bad kind of statement, such that it becomes something good. It's an interesting thing that Ajay Rao has written about. So the fact that it's a curse is not really central. The fact that if anything, the thing that we are left with is that it is somehow a form of divine speech, because this is a manifestation of Saraswati, but it's not clear that gives it what particular force it gives it. Though I think we could generally read it as sort of the rest of the frame of the Ramayana, the discussions of Rama's sons, Kusha and Lava, who happen to be, in this roundabout way, become Valmiki's students and the first sort of reciters of the poem. They're the people who recite the poem for Rama the first time. And they're clearly this kind of representation of some kind of early sort of bardic community of singers and musicians who are, not just through the sort of story about the shloka, but through their sort of presentation, their incorporation into Valmiki's sort of disciple network. They're sort of ordained as sort of somehow being a part of the kind of Brahmanical Vedic world. So I'm particularly interested then in kind of what happened to the magic of poetry. I'm running up on time, I see. So I'm going to kind of flag a few things that I'm thinking about in terms of what happens to this magic of poetry. Given that we have a kind of magical framing, but sort of Valmiki's sort of heirs, the sort of poets of the early Kāvya movement, in the first millennium of the Common Era, are not endowed with the kind of same metaphysical capabilities. In some ways, this may not be unexpected, but I think it warrants some explanation, or at least trying to explain it, I think kind of reveals certain interesting things about Kāvya, how it works, what it was thought to be. So if we kind of bracket this early account, the sort of traditional account of where poetry comes from, and also begin to think about some of the scholarly accounts of the origins of Kāvya, then I think we can start to identify a few threads that we might try to kind of pull together, create some kind of narrative about. So maybe not unrelated to the story of Valmiki and the Ramayana, some scholars like to trace the origins of Kāvya all the way to the Vedic tradition, to the Rig Veda in particular. And there are compelling reasons for this. Chief among them, perhaps, the fact that Kavi and Kāvya, these sort of central terms for talking about poetry, first appear in the Rig Veda. They appear a lot, right? The sort of Kavi is perhaps the protagonist of the Rig Veda in many ways, right? It's about these earliest documents in Sanskrit are themselves poetic compositions, right? And self-consciously so. And they're supposed to be inspired. They're supposed to sort of touch and articulate truths and reality, speak to the gods in particularly direct ways. The issue that we butt up against, though, is that the poetry of the Rig Veda, and we can call it poetry, and not just scripture, but poetic in form, is not a lot like poetry from the Ramayana on. It's not a lot like the classical tradition of Kāvya in Sanskrit and Prakrit and sort of other South Asian languages. There are some maybe universal overlaps in terms of certain kinds of poetic devices that are used, metaphor, other kinds of locutions and things like that. But they seem to be distinct sort of poetic traditions, even if there's a sort of shared terminology. So this has sort of led some people to try to articulate, like, what is the link? And some people might say that it's simply a survival that sort of Kavi, Kāvya are used to sort of describe the sort of classical material that we sort of see Valmiki thinking about or doing, and certainly the later classical tradition that finds its sort of origins in Valmiki's work. But they're simply sort of using sort of some sort of older Sanskrit terms, but not inheriting much of the conceptual universe. And this, I think, is the perspective of certain people who, especially who like to see Kāvya as purely kind of secular activity. Secular activity that's bound to a court, which is a kind of secular space where people are doing politics and poetry and certain kinds of speech skills are essential for diplomacy or sort of social survival, for being able to flatter people or insult them in sort of, clever ways, ways that on the insult side might not let you get caught or give you plausible deniability. Or for people needing to write diplomatic documents, inscriptions that are sort of pronounced royal proclamations. But I think all that is true. But I think kind of ignoring the, let's call it religious dimension for now, or the metaphysical dimension, means that you're missing out on something of the kind of social and performative context that Kāvya is a part of, that is working in. And especially thinking about courts, right, the kind of key figure in the court, I'll get to this curious thing in a moment, is the figure of the Purohita. And Stephanie Jameson in particular, who's a scholar of the Veda, has made to me a kind of compelling suggestion that the sort of link between the Vedic tradition and the classical Kāvya tradition is probably through this figure of the Purohita, which is a particular kind of priest, minister, generally Brahmin figure, who's a bit separate from the sort of traditional, sort of oldest domains of sort of Vedic ritual that maybe kings are sponsoring. But is in particular usually a priest supposed to be skilled in the Atharva Veda, which is this kind of somewhat adjacent to the kind of high ritual tradition, and is more interested in sort of, let's say, practical magic or practical ritual for protection, healing, hurting your enemies, things like that. And this Purohita and the priests of the Atharva Veda are also very much connected to this culture of auspiciousness and divination and astral science, which is really pervasive in sort of political royal culture and the at the time where the Kāvya movement is emerging in the late centuries before the Common Era and into the early centuries of the beginning of the Common Era. And this divinatory culture is concerned with a lot of things. Basically, it's this culture concerned with signs and sort of interpreting signs and what they mean for success or the opposite. So around kings, a lot of it has to do with their bodies. A lot of the sign culture has to do with basically marriage arrangements and reproduction, and sort of making good matches in that sense. So it has to do with birth charts and things like that, but also like what the composition, the structure of the body is supposed to indicate certain things. So going through some of this, I found the level of the sign up to the butt, basically. The resemblance of a man's butt to that of a frog is a sign that they're destined to be a king. But there are all kinds of signs that get incorporated. And I think the thing that happens is that at some point these signs stop being just indications, but are understood and sometimes manipulated because they're imagined to also be causes of the very things that they're meant to indicate. So not just signs, but the sources of prosperity and so forth. And sort of Kāvya culture participates in this in particular ways because it's meant to be, right? The emphasis is on beauty, on it being charmed, and literally ornamented. Alangkara is the term, alankrita, which means both an ornament and a kind of often apotropaic charm of some kind. And I think there's this kind of shading going on between the sort of interest in beauty and the sort of using Kāvya being a part of this, a part of this culture of kind of prosperity, of beauty, and success around sort of courts, politics, social life. And kind of to circle back to the Ramayana just for 1 second, sort of jumping over a lot of things here, because I want to leave a little time. I think one thing that the Ramayana also indicates in the story, and really in the arc of the whole text, is that it's really, I think, one reading, if you want to try to give a reading of the Ramayana, right, this massive thing, try to isolate some kind of through line. One reading of it is that it's a text that's deeply concerned with auspiciousness and beauty and what these actually are, how these actually relate to reality and success. Right, I mean, I think we find indications of the royal culture throughout the text in certain ways, right? Often kings, Rama's father Dasharatha, and then the demon king Ravana are described as being waking up to these sort of auspicious sounds, auspicious music, often sing songs, instruments. This is a common thing that we see in a lot of texts on like the routine of a king. Right? They need to be surrounded by this auspicious stuff because it means that they're being protected from astrological danger, and that has ramifications not just for themselves but for their whole kingdom. But I think we see this in sort of the heart of the Ramayana, as many people see it in the Sundarakanda, when we see Sita in Ravana's kingdom, which is this extended meditation on beauty, right? Lanka is a very beautiful place, but it's also in some ways a very ugly place because it's filled with Rakshasas. It's a place of great success and happiness and prosperity, but there's a sense that Sita there, even though it's a place where her like purity and the sort of Brahmanical sort of culture is called into question, that she is nonetheless this kind of fundamentally auspicious being and entity. And then when we come to the Uttarakanda, the kind of conclusion of the Ramayana and the sort of tribulations that go on with Sita's reincorporation into Ayodhya and Rama's kingdom, there's also this question, right, that in the tension between the sort of the public aspect of Rama that we often talk about, and sort of the rumors that go on about Sita's infidelity and so forth. And all of that discussion, when you read the Sanskrit, is talked about in terms of Shubha and Ashubha. And my sense is that the text is really emphasizing this kind of anxiety about kind of superficial auspiciousness, let's say, superficial beauty, sort of things looking good, and things actually being good. Things actually being auspicious. And that is not just the tension of Rama, I would say, and his relationship with Sita, the sort of personal public pull, but I think it's something that characterizes certain discussions around kingship and ultimately Kāvya even, about whether it's beautiful and what that means for what it does. And I think the Ramayana is sort of in conversation with certain kinds of Buddhist and Jain material likely, which is also sort of pushing against certain ideas about auspiciousness as being just about signs of prosperity, but rather trying to sort of shift the conversation such that Shubha and Ashubha are less about causing or indicating prosperity and more about indicating or causing a certain kind of ethical alignment with reality, with being good in certain ways. So let me stop there. I talked for too long, but happy to talk more, take any questions. I know